So why would pleasure that's just an arbitrary criteria. Why is pleasure the criteria?
Well, there's like the cradle argument and stuff. Ultimately, going back to any foundation, so there exist problems with grounding morality objectively, no matter what your foundation is, because you have this is-ought problem, right?
It basically comes back to epistemology. And yes, it is true, there is the is-ought issue.
Right.
How do you get an ought from an is?
Right.
I see morality in terms of being that which is commanded. It is somebody telling somebody else, you should not do this. It's basically a law. And so what we have to do is we have to think about epistemology, and we have to think about where do we find the information about who is the worthy authority to say you should do this and you should do that. Everybody has an ultimate authority that they appeal to understand morality and understand reality.
So if there isn't God, then it's not the case that morality goes out the window, right? Because at any rate, there would be some other highest authority other than God, correct?
Well, it wouldn't be. It would be a form of morality, but it would be a perverted morality. It would be a subjective morality, and so it's hard to call a subjective morality a morality if it's just billions of different opinions from billions of different people. All these little lawgivers saying, you shouldn't do that, I don't like that, don't do that. But the other person says the very opposite. Hey, I say I should do this. You should not tell me to do that. So it's just a bunch of people giving out these little commands. And so in that worldview, you can't determine which command is highest and which one should rule over the other commands. In a Christian worldview, we have the ultimate command giver who tells us all what to do. And that gives us morality, a sensible morality in which we can actually understand what we should do.
Does this not render your morality arbitrary, though? Like God could easily have commanded infanticide, right? Like if God said there's nothing wrong with murder, then it would be okay, right?
Right. It's all about command, what the commands of God and His character. But God is not going to command that murder, like killing an innocent person, would be okay for humans to do because it's against His character.
So what if
His character determines morality.
Okay, but if His character were such, then it would be fine.
Sure, but that God doesn't exist. So again, it comes back to epistemology. How do we know what exists?
Well, we don't know whether or not God. Well, don't know in the strict sense whether or not God exists, right?
Well, I do. So we have to think about knowledge. Knowledge is justified true belief. Do you agree with that?
I agree that it's just generally applicable. I think Gettier cases are problems, but but I think generally speaking that's a solid definition.
Yeah. So how do we justify any belief that we have if we put our faith in finite, limited consciousness that doesn't have all the facts?
Well, to derive a belief in a God, though, you still have to begin with yourself, right?
Well, you can't even posit a self without faith in the Christian worldview, because you can't tell that you can't even know that a self exists without the Christian worldview. Sure. Well, how do you? I mean,
I think therefore I am, right. If I have the ability to doubt whether I exist, then I must exist because there's something with the ability to do so. Right?
Well, the thing is, you don't know that. So consciousness, for all we know, could just be basically a long or a rapid succession of micro consciousnesses that only exist for a nanosecond, and if those existed in a stream, it could look like what we're experiencing right now, but we wouldn't be able to distinguish what we're experiencing right now from that, because it would be kind of like an animated movie where you have a bunch of pictures showing up in rapid succession.
Sure.
So if you have a bunch of consciousnesses going in and out, going into existence and out of existence in rapid succession, you can't say I exist, because there's a consciousness doesn't even last long enough to say I or even think I. So I think therefore I am becomes problematic. You could, at that point you could say, well, there's a self, but at that point you're just saying there's just something.
Yeah.
or there's consciousness.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that doesn't get us anywhere. Like, just saying consciousness exists, or maybe consciousness doesn't exist and everything is just a giant mass of colors, shapes, and things we think are mental concepts, but maybe they're just something else that we don't understand, and we think they belong in minds and that they're in minds, but maybe mental concepts are just something else that we don't understand, along with the colors and shapes and just this qualia. So, like, how do we don't know if reality is that, we don't know if it's the rapid succession, we don't know if it's what we're experiencing, people normally think of as two human beings with brains that exist over 70 years and then die. We don't know what it is if we put faith in finite consciousness to come to conclusions about reality.
I guess my question though is, like, how could you ground any sort of belief in anything if you didn't ground it? So you need a justification, right? Justify true belief.
Right, you need justification for what you believe.
So how do you justify, like, belief in God? I guess is my question, because I don't understand how you could do that without appealing to something preceding, right?
Well, the ultimate epistemological starting point is faith in God. So
it's an
I'm just operating according to the knowledge that everything is faith, everything is based on faith. We're all putting faith in something at all times. So in order to justify anything, you have to use faith, because faith is basically synonymous with belief. Justified true belief is involved in knowledge. So faith is involved in knowledge. Faith is required for knowledge. So the justification for the belief that God exists is that you could not have justification for any belief about anything if he did not exist.
But how would that, okay, so when I'm hearing this, right, if I take that to be true,
yeah,
I would then adopt hardline skepticism, right? Denying the existence of, denying that I have knowledge altogether. Because I still don't see how I would justify a belief in God, right? And if I can't have knowledge about anything without knowledge of God, and I don't see how I can justify belief in God, then I would adopt the stance that knowledge is fundamentally impossible.
Okay,
and then it would be impossible to know whether or not you need God, right? Like, that's another tricky problem.
Well, then, if you can't justify beliefs, then the things that everything that came out of your mouth is meaningless, and so what you just communicate is kind of self-refuting.
I mean, yeah, but I'd say that your position falls into a vicious circularity, right?
Well, I'd say all reasoning is circular, because you always have to circle back to an ultimate starting point. And for your epistemology. So my ultimate starting point is revelation from God. And so I have two options I can put faith in. I can put faith in a worldview in which there's God's all-knowing consciousness that has all the facts along with our little consciousnesses. Or, on the other hand, I could put faith in a worldview in which there's no all-knowing consciousness and there's a bunch of little consciousnesses that don't know everything. Okay. So should I put my faith in the worldview with no all-knowing consciousness? No, because I couldn't justify any belief in that worldview. I should put my faith in the worldview with the all-knowing consciousness, because with that worldview, I can justify beliefs, because the revelation from the all-knowing one comes to my consciousness, therefore justifying my beliefs, because he knows all the facts. He can tell me what's true about reality, as opposed to just relying on finite consciousness, which can't justify beliefs because I could always be wrong about what I think is true.
Right, but you are still coming back to, okay, so I guess
all faith.
Sure, but
right.
If it's all faith, and faith is some sort of like axiomatic starting point, right? Like reducible to something, then at that point, right, if everything's based on faith, and faith is like a mere assumption or assertion, right, some sort of axiomatic starting point, then I think that it would be logical to conclude that all bases of knowledge, all claims of knowledge are interesting in terms of how they are like a chain of if-then statements, but without the ability to like demonstrate or somehow ground your initial like statement, then the rest of it like falls apart, if that makes sense. So think about mathematics, right? So we have Euclidean geometry, and Euclid has this postulate, parallel postulate. Doesn't necessarily matter except for the case that these axioms were kind of assumed by Euclid, right? Euclid was like, well, these are obviously true. Turns out that on, say, like a sphere, like the Earth, Euclid's parallel postulate isn't true. And so it is the case that an equilateral triangle has side lengths of 60. Yeah, has angles of 60, right? If Euclid's parallel postulate is true. But if it isn't true, which is not on a sphere, then that's not necessarily the case, right? So any graph, because on a sphere you can have a triangle with, say, like 3 right angles. So if we're asserting things axiomatically, then that doesn't seem to provide like any objective true knowledge. It seems to simply provide like, if this is true, then this is also true. But
Well,
we don't know if the first thing is true yet.
I'm recognizing that all reasoning is circular. There's vicious circularity that occurs when you rely on finite consciousness that doesn't know everything. But if you're putting faith in all-knowing consciousness that has all the facts, then you can be justified in putting faith in that. There's justification for your beliefs when revelation is being put in a mind that knows everything and you're trusting in that mind.
It's a very, like, I know God exists because God exists, though, right? Like, it's this, like, begging the question, right? Because you can't know that God exists. Essentially what I'm hearing, at least, right, is that I know God exists, and I know this because God exists.
I know it because I could not know anything at all if he did not exist. It's a transcendental argument.
What if you don't know anything? Well,
then this conversation would be meaningless. So I'm always operating on faith that I do know something. I have to put faith in, I have to use faith as I'm talking to you every second that I'm interacting with you. I'm using faith, and if I can't justify the faith that I have about anything, then I'm engaging in absurdity. I'm going to, instead of trusting in what doesn't make sense and thinking like everything that I would say and do would just be absurd. So I don't want to engage in absurdity. I want to put faith, since I have an option in what I put faith in, I'm going to choose all-knowing being who justifies beliefs, instead of choosing a worldview in which the only type of consciousness is limited. So that's my two options.
But how do you know that those are your only two options, right? So what if I just put my faith in a worldview in which I have a continuous mind, right? And then I use rationalism, because I can equally, as justified, do that, correct?
Well, that's one of the options that I already mentioned. That's a finite consciousness that doesn't have all the facts.
But if I just assume that I can derive knowledge this way, say through Cartesian rationalism, like that can be axiomatic in the exact same way that your belief in God could be. So what's the problem? Why not?
Because you don't have all the facts about reality in your mind. So what you're trusting in is a mind that doesn't have all the facts about reality in it. That's different than what I'm trusting in when I put faith in the all-knowing mind.
What I'm trying to get at here is that you're advocating for believing in something before you can derive any sort of knowledge, right?
Knowledge requires faith. You can't have knowledge without faith.
So, and you're saying that, well, this jump will secure me knowledge, right? I can, since that
it's not a jump. It's not a jump.
Since that first assertion is unjustified, right? Like,
no, it is justified. It's a transcendental argument. It's circular. Everything's circular.
Okay.
It's just the proof that God exists is that if he didn't exist, you could not prove anything. The justification for belief in God is the fact that you could not justify any belief if he didn't exist.
Well, I don't agree. Right? And so
well, because you're not understanding how omniscience is required for justification for beliefs.
I certainly don't. Like, let's take the quality, right, that I'm perceiving right now. I can certainly, let's say there is no God. I can know the shapes and colors that I am perceiving. Maybe I don't know any facts about any external world, if it exists, what is causing these perceptions, or what these perceptions mean, right? Maybe like I see something, and as I read it, I'm mistaken into what it's saying. Right? Into the meaning of the words. But as I'm directly looking at something, maybe I'm already mistaken about something that I was looking at a second ago. My memory is faulty. But as I'm directly observing something, I can't be mistaken about the qualia directly imposed upon my mind.
But you don't know what I consists of. When you say I, what is that? Because if everything you're experiencing is actually, but it could be a hive mind. So you're using the word thing, that's a singular. That's singular when it could be plural.
Then the sure.
Right.
Okay?
So which one are you trusting in, the hive mind or the
I'm simply
singular?
saying that no matter what is doing the perceiving, cannot be mistaken as to what it perceives.
Well,
right?
you don't
as
now.
the qualia like set upon it.
You're assuming that perception exists. You're assuming that information is going from one thing to another, but you can't prove that without
I'm not
without
assuming
God.
that, in fact, I'm assuming that there exists qualia, that there exist images, right? Because certainly I'm perceiving it right now. There's no way I can doubt that. That is absolutely certain.
You can't know that you're perceiving it because perception requires information going from one thing to another.
That is not what I'm asserting. I'm not asserting that I'm perceiving information from one thing to another. Perhaps these images are asserted are fictitious, right? Perhaps they are only existent in my consciousness, right? So if you want to define my consciousness. I'm not asserting that there is an actual, say, sign here, which is like somehow transmitting information. I'm asserting that this qualia exists, right?
Okay,
that
so
the images and shapes.
That's different than saying perception.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm saying I'm not asserting like, perception. That
Okay.
there's this qualia that I experience. And I'm asserting that even if God did not exist, I could not be mistaken about the exact qualia that I'm presently experiencing.
Well, that would require for you to exist long enough to have a belief. And I believe that in order for a belief to occur, you have to exist long enough. But you don't know that any consciousness exists long enough to have a belief. And knowledge is justified true belief. Therefore, you can't have knowledge if you can't justify the belief that knowledge exists if you can't justify the belief that beliefs exist. Because you can't prove that any consciousness lasts long enough to have a belief. Because for all you know, we're in some kind of reality in which different micro consciousnesses last for a nanosecond in rapid succession.
For a second, let's just take I, in this case, to colloquially mean perhaps that succession of consciousnesses then, right? Because clearly there is some kind of belief appearance, right, in my mind. My taken however liberally we wish to take it. And these...
So you can't even use the English language.
Well, because we're getting into ontology, right? And ontology is tricky. Right?
Well,
you're using the word no when you're talking about something you've assumed. And so I'm trying to demonstrate that there can be... So I'm a Cartesian rationalist, right? Abandoning the like nitpickies for now, I'm just going to lay out the view. There are certain things which are absolutely certain, right? And those being whether or not, like, there are some that people would say are also absolutely certain, but one of them, which is under the rationalist view undeniable, is the qualia, right?